right, today we start looking at the Civil War itself. Our goal here is to look at how the war is fought, so as to be able to understand what needs to be done when it's over to put it back together, because that's where we're going next with this reconstruction. And also, we need to look at the war to see how the war evolves itself. And our primary focus there is looking at the goals, the war aims. What are we fighting for? How does that possibly change throughout the effort and because of the effort? There's, in some cases, it's the way the war is going to impact what we say our goal for the war is. What is peace going to look like? What's going to be different after it's over? Before we get into this, if you've ever seen any photos or drawings of combat, you wouldn't see any photos. They couldn't take pictures of combat back then. The camera exposure took too long. So if you try to take a picture of a Civil War battlefield, all that would have gotten is a big old smear. But if you've ever seen any drawings, artwork of Civil War battles, or seen any kind of Civil War recreation, or seen it portrayed in the movies, the question I get from students all the time is, why'd they fight like that? And if you've never seen that, what people are asking is, why do they line up shoulder to shoulder in open spaces and just go out and wail away on each other? Get the question, were they dumb? And the short answer is no. It has a lot to do with the weapons that they had available to them at the time. So I've got a couple of pictures here to help illustrate this point. Prior to the Civil War, the primary weapon that was available was a smoothbore musket. And some of you guys have probably done a little bit of black powder hunting, and so maybe you've gone through this process. But a smoothbore muzzle loading musket can be fired if you're really good at it. The Civil War soldier was expected to be able to get off a shot every 17 seconds. That's what the manual basically said that they should be able to do. So 3 shots in a minute. And I can't imagine what that was like, trying to load and fire that weapon, that multi-step process where you're pouring the gunpowder down the barrel and trying to ram home the bullet and then put a percussion cap on it and pull the trigger all in the same time, while you're under fire in battle. So, it was just,
and the rifle gets hot.
Yeah, Mr. Pierce just points out that yes, the rifle gets hot while you're shooting it too, and it's you've got all kinds of other noise and things going on. I don't know how these guys were able to do this, but the smoothbore musket is only accurate to where you actually would take aim and hit something on the battlefield to about 50 yards. And that was under the best of circumstances. If you've ever shot a black powder rifle, it puts out a huge puff of smoke. And if you've got a few thousand people doing that at the same time, you're not going to be able to see what you're aiming at pretty quickly. And you've got a weapon that throws essentially a knuckleball. My sports fans out there, the muzzle loader, the smoothbore musket firing a round ball, it's going to come out tumbling every which way. If you've ever fired a BB gun, BBs pretty much go wherever they want to go once they're flying. And those weapons were set up where there's a hole in the back where you put your percussion cap on. So when you fired it, there was a little puff of smoke that came out of the back too. You were actually not even supposed to really take aim. A lot of the military instructions said that you were supposed to get your face out of the way when it was time to pull a trigger. Because if you've got your face anywhere close to that, you might take some of that stuff in the eye and be done fighting for the day. So really, the idea that you could load your weapon and draw a bead on anything and really hit it was almost fantasy. So the way generals were taught and officers were taught, the way you won battles with a weapon that was that inaccurate was that you trained your soldiers to be disciplined enough to be able to get those 3 shots off in a minute and to line up shoulder to shoulder. And you massed as many men as you could in the battle at once. and you all fired in the same direction, and you were going to hit something. And if you could stand there longer than your opponent could, and you could, have that training and ignore everything else that's going on around you and keep firing. And then after you fired a couple of shots, the expectation was that you would fix bayonets. If you've ever seen any of those, the knife that goes on the end, and you would charge the enemy while they're trying to reload. You close that distance, and then you go hand-to-hand combat. So most of the soldiers, or excuse me, the officers that were commanding Civil War armies were trained that this was the primary weapon and this was the technique that you were going to use. You pack them in there, you fire a couple of rounds, you fix bayonets, and then just whoever's been trained to be able to stand there and take it more than the other side is going to win. Along the way, there was rifling. That was developed well before the Civil War. So if you look at this picture here, that's rifling, what makes a gun a rifle. Those spiral grooves that are cut inside the barrel. Now, at first they used a round ball with rifling, and that was better than a smoothbore, which is essentially like looking down a pipe. It's right there in the name, smoothbore. That really is going to come out tumbling every which way. This is going to be a little bit more accurate. This is going to be more like throwing a football where you try and get that nice spiral, cut it through the wind. And, if you've thrown a football before, the better your spiral is, the more accurate your throw is going to be. It's going to get where it needs to be. And then right before the war, there was an innovation down here. I've got a picture. These are a French innovation. Man that developed it, his last name was Manet, and it gets mispronounced during the war, and people start calling these mini balls. And you can see that they've got that hollow cavity in the back. Well, that's where your gunpowder would be. When that goes off, that hollow, this soft lead, is going to expand into those grooves, and that bullet is going to come out faster and much more accurate than what they had here. Now, the officers have essentially been trained, and all the manuals tell them that this is the weapons that you're going to be using. By the beginning of the war even, and by the end of it, they've got repeating weapons that are going to have this potential to be that much more accurate. They're going to be accurate to, in some cases, 6 to 8 times farther than what they were trained. And so some generals were slow to learn this lesson, that this is the weapon, the cutting edge technology during the war. People are going to pay for that with their lives, where they still were in that mindset that you had to line up and get shoulder to shoulder because you weren't going to be able to hit anything. Well, you could actually aim and hit something with this one. Now, whether you can do that under fire is a much more difficult question, but this is something that you can actually take aim with and have some sort of expectation of hitting your target, unlike this one where it really was almost like an accident if you hit what you were trying to aim at. So long story short, because of the tactics, because every death involved is an American death, because it is the first total war, because it lasts 4 years, because disease was rampant and medicine at that time really was more just like have a drink of whiskey and hope you get better. There wasn't, the antibiotics were unheard of. You get an infection, there's a very good chance that was going to kill you. So the number of disease deaths are off the chart here. The Civil War is the deadliest war in American history by far. You essentially have to take all of the other American wars, combine their total number of deaths to equal the Civil War death. Civil War death is so bad that we're not even 100% sure what the number is. For decades, the accepted number was 660,000. But more modern research seems to indicate that that's probably low. The number could be as high as 850,000. When the war was over, the government didn't have a count. Those original counts came from amateur historians going back and trying to figure it out just from the records and the paperwork that was created during the war. So there's a lot of guesswork involved with all of this because it was such a major undertaking that the government couldn't keep up with it even during the war. All right, as I talk about this, some terminology that you guys need to know. Just part of this is you just need to know because you're an American and people will talk about this stuff. It's not just for my class. When I'm talking about the U.S. or the Union, I'm talking about the North. Okay. If you hear me talk about the Confederacy or the CSA or the Confederates, that's the South. All right. The president's involved. Abraham Lincoln, we should know him. On the Confederate side, their president was Jefferson Davis. Now, the argument here, what this war boils down to, is the South is trying to make this into their own country. So they viewed Jefferson Davis as their president. But what you need to understand is, from the Union perspective, Jefferson Davis is not a president. He is a rebel breaking the law that needs to be brought to heel. Okay. The most successful general for the North is Ulysses S. Grant. The most successful general for the South is Robert E. Lee. Their chief lieutenants, so Grant's second in command, so to speak, is William Tecumseh Sherman. Lee had several. Stonewall Jackson's the most famous name, but Stonewall Jackson dies halfway through the war. He dies at the Battle of Chancellorsville. There's the respective flags. So you know that one. That's the stars and bars, and that one there is actually the Confederate battle flag that later becomes their country's flag. The Capitol, Washington, D.C. You can actually see the Capitol Dome here is being built during the Civil War. Lincoln made sure that construction process continued, even though, maybe some of those guys could have been used elsewhere. His argument was, if we keep building the Capitol, we're showing people that the country will continue. The Confederate capital was in Richmond, Virginia, which is not that far away from Washington, D.C. So one of the things, if you read about the Civil War, the Union Army is constantly talking about on to Richmond. You're talking about separation of a matter of miles between the two capitals. And the colors, every now and again, you'll hear it referred to as the blue versus the gray. The Union, the U.S., with their blue uniforms, and the Confederates with their gray uniforms. But actually, most Confederate soldiers wouldn't have had gray. They pretty much wore whatever they had. That's one of the problems that Confederates are going to have throughout this conflict, is not coming up with enough supplies to be able to fight. So the more common color actually was a natural dye called butternut. It really should be the blue and the brown if you really want to be accurate when you talk about the Civil War. All right, so let's talk about the big questions here. What are we actually trying to get at with this whole presentation? Number one, what was the South after when they were fighting this war? Number two, what was the North after when they were fighting this war? And one of the things that we need to look at for that one is, you can't, in many cases, find just that one thing that the North is going to say they're fighting for. In history, rarely can we just say, this is what the people wanted. You've got millions of people up north, and they're all going to be on different pages about what they think this war is about. Some are going to be just flat out opposed to the war, period. But those that are in support of the war are going to be all over the map in terms of what they think victory should be about. What do they say they're fighting for? Third big question to throw at you here is, can you win a war by just not losing? Is it possible to be victorious by just not being defeated? And then the fourth big question is, can you win the war but then lose the peace? The question there is, militarily, can you take care of business and do what you need to do and defeat and conquer and occupy enemy territory, but then on the backside of the war actually fail to accomplish what you said you were going to accomplish, and so thus lose the peace? What did we say we were fighting for? Those are four big questions that we want to look at as we try and establish this, because again, that's going to be huge when we start talking about Reconstruction. what is it that we're trying to fix? What are we trying to get out of this effort? All right, so let's take a look at this and let's look at why this happened and look at the differences between the North and the South and how they were almost becoming two separate countries, two separate societies. Um, Economically, the North was becoming much more what our economy is today, an industrialized, urbanized society. And then there were broad, wide areas of agriculture where they're growing corn, wheat, cows, pigs. So the North is much more what we think of when we think of our modern American economy. The South was, in a lot of ways, holding on to a type of economy. I mentioned this in class the other day that goes back thousands of years. Agriculture, with slaves doing a lot of the manual labor. What they did in the South primarily was grow cotton. Cotton was king. That was something that they were counting on for victory in this war. That Great Britain and France, who had a large textile industry, were going to be dependent upon Southern cotton. So they were counting on French and British support in the war, so they would be able to keep getting Southern cotton. So that was the dominant form of money making in the South, were cash crops, cotton, tobacco, to a lesser extent rice, but big cash crops. And then the rest of the area primarily was taken up with small subsistence farms. So those people that grew food primarily were doing it just for themselves. That's what a subsistence farm is. You are farming to feed yourself to stay alive. And so the irony of the Civil War from the Southern perspective is that they are going to be an agricultural country that is going to, in many ways, starve to death because they're going to really struggle to supply themselves with food. The primary thing that they grow is not the kind of stuff that you can eat. You don't eat cotton. You only eat after you sell it and take that money and convert it into food that you purchase somewhere else. Socially, the North was again becoming much more like what we think of today, where you have a free labor force, you know, putting themselves to work in growing cities. Cities of the North were growing. And then there's an influx of immigration coming into the North. The South was entirely dependent upon the slave system. Socially, then there was a caste system in the South, a hierarchy of races in the South. Politically, the North was looking for higher tariffs and a larger national government. Those two go hand in hand. The idea there is that they're going to eliminate foreign competition by making it more expensive, whereas Southerners look for lower tariffs. Their primary interest is just keeping their products cheaper. They're not necessarily benefiting from the growth of Northern industry, at least from their perspective. And then the final point there, states' rights, where they want a smaller federal government and with stronger state governments. And this is a good example of those, even those things that aren't slavery as causes of the war are slavery. It's the primary reason that Southern states wanted strong states' rights positions is that they were counting on their state's government to defend, from their perspective, from white Southerners' perspective, the right to own a slave. And they didn't want the national government interfering with that right from, again, their perspective. All right, so slavery is the driving cause of this war. It is more than anything else. And again, even those things that aren't slavery are underneath them slavery. So let's look at what did people feel about that. Obviously, if you're African American, you're opposed to slavery. Do I need to really cover that one? Point number two, Southern whites. The majority of Southern whites were not slave owners. But it is important to make sure that you note mentally that those that were not, almost to a person, were supportive of the slave system, aspired to be slave owners in many cases. This was their way of life. You would be hard pressed to find many Southern whites that were opposed to the slavery system. So then really this breaks down as a question of what do Northern whites think of slavery? And you remember when we were talking a couple of days ago,
I need a teacher with a first hour prep to dial 18700. I need a teacher with a first hour prep to dial 18700. Thank you.
I mentioned that the average Northerner was like, when it comes to slavery, it's somebody else's problem somewhere else. So we need to look at there's like a spectrum of attitudes about slavery, and it's almost like a bell curve distribution where the ends are not very big and most people are somewhere in the middle. There were some Northern whites that are strongly in favor of slavery. That's the way of the world from their perspective, and it's the way the world had always been. And then you get into this more middle section where people have maybe some trouble with it. They don't like it, but then, they're racist. They don't want blacks to be free. Something about the system bothers them, but they're not going to do anything or want to upset that system. Then there's some that like hate slavery. They want to see it end, but they still don't look at blacks as being equal. This is where Abraham Lincoln was prior to the Civil War, and we'll talk about his personal evolution as we start working our way through the war here. But that bullet point right there would describe Abraham Lincoln. And then there is a small but vocal minority of Northerners that hate the system and want to see black and white equality and are willing to do something about it. Now, that's a big step. I don't like it is pretty easy to say, but there's a pretty big step to say, I don't like this system and I'm willing to do something, potentially put my life on the line to end it. So that is a long way off. All right, who are we talking about here? Primarily, the Democratic Party is the party of slavery in the South. So as we look at elections, keep that in mind. It is the party of most white Northerners that are opposed to any sort of form of equality. The Republican Party was the party founded on the idea of limiting the growth of slavery. It is hated in the South at that time. And then there's a smaller group within the Republican Party, radical Republicans. If you remember our discussion of the political spectrum from the first week of school, those on the extreme left on the American political spectrum are the radicals. And at this time in history, this was a radical idea that there should be racial equality. This is not necessarily a descriptor of the majority of Republicans, especially coming into the war. Now, as we study the war, there's going to be a growing number of people within the Republican Party that are going to start buying into that idea. But the radical Republicans were the small but vocal minority that were looking for racial equality and see the Civil War as a chance to really reinvent Southern society. All right, what is it that caused the war to begin? We've looked at the background causes. The event was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln does not receive a single popular vote in most Southern states. He definitely does not win any electoral college votes and still wins the election. What the message that sends to Southern Democrats, Southern states, is that their national influence has evaporated. Now, if they thought about it, the fact that they divided their votes multiple ways, between Douglas and Breckinridge primarily is what opened the door for Abraham Lincoln to win the state after state in the North. Had that not happened, Lincoln maybe doesn't win. There are 6 out of 10 people who vote for somebody else other than Abraham Lincoln. He only gets 40% of the vote, but because the Democrats are splitting their votes 3 other ways there, he's able to win. And so their attitude is the North has just elected a person who is a representative from a party that has made it a stated goal to attack the institution of slavery, to limit its spread. And in their minds, that's a small step to somebody saying, I'm going to actually go after slavery where it is. So their mindset is, if we're going to maintain the slavery system, we're going to have to get out of this government. And so not long after the election, about a month after the election becomes official, this is going to start the process of states leaving the Union. And the first state to leave is South Carolina. We haven't covered a lot of the stuff that happened in the 1830s, but South Carolina, they were the ones that were making noise going all the way back to
the 1830s about states' rights and attacking high tariffs. So it's not surprising that they're the first ones to lead this charge out of the Union. And so what actually brings the first firing is that there's a fort in Charleston Harbor called Fort Sumter. Now, from South Carolina's perspective, to make sure you understand the idea of secession, from South Carolina's perspective, they are now a foreign country. They are not part of the United States. They are the foreign country of South Carolina, and that means in their mind that Fort Sumter is theirs, and that if there's any U.S. forces there, that is the equivalent of an invading force. Now, Lincoln's in a tough position here. He doesn't want to be the aggressor. He doesn't want to show the world and his country that he's bloodthirsty and spoiling for a fight. But by the same token, he can't just walk away and let South Carolina strong arm him out of Fort Sumter and just be able to walk away from the Union. He's president of the United States. And part of his oath of office is to defend the Constitution. And South Carolina's under that Constitution. In his mind, this is just a criminal activity. So Lincoln does a pretty brilliant thing politically. He makes it clear to South Carolina that he's not going anywhere. The troops that are in Fort Sumter will not leave, but he's not going to send anything militarily to support them. All he's going to do is send them food and medicine and those things to maintain those people that are already there. And that's not sufficient for South Carolina. So in April of 1861, they opened fire on Fort Sumter. Now, the actual Battle of Fort Sumter is not much of a battle at all. There's nobody is killed in the Battle of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, the guys there are able to hunker down and protect themselves from the shelling that the Confederates are throwing at them. The only casualties of the fight, ironically enough, there's a horse that's killed in the shelling, and the only other person that's hurt, there's a soldier that's actually killed during the surrender ceremony. Ironically enough, they're firing a salute to the flag, and the cannon explodes, and so one of the guys that is there, as part of the surrender ceremony, is killed. That's the only casualty of the first battle in the deadliest war in American history. Okay, before you go on, click on this and watch that. When this war breaks out, people think that it's going to be a short war. Lincoln calls for 90-day volunteers to deal with the crisis. So that gives you an idea of the mindset, what he thought they were into. They thought maybe there would be one big battle and this would all be over. One politician says you'll be able to wipe up all the blood with a handkerchief when the war is over. Both sides thought that they would be able to crush the opposition really easily. The North, just because they knew of all their advantages, the South, because they viewed themselves as so superior as fighting soldiers that they thought that this would be over in no time. What it turns out to be is 4 years long and the bloodiest war in American history. I need to update this. The accepted figure for years has been 660,000 people that die in the Civil War. More modern research seems to indicate that that's probably 750,000, 850,000. That 660,000, this is so big that it's beyond the ability of the government at that time to process it as it's occurring. That number, 660,000, is something that a guy that just takes it upon himself to study documents and reports after the war is able to put together some 20 years after the war is over. So other people have went back and looked at those records in greater detail and connected some dots, and 660,000 is almost assuredly 100,000 low on the low side. So, and also the single bloodiest day in American history. We're coming up on the anniversary of that. September 17th, 1862 is the bloodiest day in American history, the Battle of Antietam, which is worse than D-Day. It is worse than Pearl Harbor. It is worse than 9/11 in terms of number of Americans killed on that day. All right, once the war breaks out, what do they have going for them? Why does this end up lasting for 4 years? Well, the North has some pretty huge advantages here. They do have a higher population. They do have more weapons. They have an increased industrial capability. Essentially, the state of New York itself, just one state in the north, has multiple times the amount of industrial production capability of the entire Confederacy. Okay. Let that sink in for a second. New York by itself could multiple times over outproduce the entire industrial output of the South. The North already has an established Army, Navy, government. They have more money. They have an established money system. The Confederates are going to have to try and create a monetary system under the gun here. The railroads are better in the North, just without getting too, railroad geeky. The railroads of the North had consistent gauge, meaning the tracks were the same distance apart, which meant that a train in the North could be switched onto any other piece of track throughout the entirety of the northern states. In the South, they didn't. They had different gauges. So sometimes a train would hit the end of a line and the tracks would be different distances apart. And so everything that was on the train would have to be reloaded onto another train before it could go on. And that's discounting the idea that, hey, if the train breaks down, if the engine breaks down, the people of the North can probably fix it. The Southerners, with their limited industrial output, are really going to struggle to be able to produce that, let alone things like muskets and cannon and those things that you need to provide the soldiers shoes, uniforms. I think I already mentioned the fact it's blue versus gray, but gray is not right. It's really the butternut, the brown, because people are making their own stuff as they come to the Army. If you look at that list, it looks like the North has everything going for it. The advantages for the South is that they have home field advantage. They know the territory, and the people that are surrounding the armies are going to be giving them all kinds of intelligence. The people, if the Northern Army invades Virginia, the people of Virginia are not going to be giving information to the Union Army. Go here, go there. This is weak.
I still need one more teacher with a first hour prep. Please dial 18700. I still need one more.
Bill, can I open this?
The biggest Southern advantage that they have is that they have more trained generals. If you go to West Point, the War College, they had a higher Southern population than it had a Northern population. So as we'll look at this, when the war breaks out, those that are the more accomplished generals tend to be from the South. One big advantage that the South has in its side, it goes back to that question of, can you win the war by just not losing? The North has to conquer the South. They have to win. In order for this to be over, they have to defeat the South, because they are essentially trying to force the South back into the Union, and they don't want to come back in. So you're going to have to conquer them to make that happen. The South doesn't need to do that. All they want, in the words of Jefferson Davis, their president, is to be let alone. All they have to do is not lose. If it ever gets to a point where the Northern people or the Northern government decide they're done fighting and they don't want to fight this anymore, it'll be over and they will be victorious. So that is a huge advantage of theirs. They don't have to win. All they have to do to win is not lose and get to where the people of the North say, enough. We have put enough money and blood into this that we don't want to continue it. Okay? That is a huge advantage for the South. And one more point that's not there, so add it to your notes, is that at least at the beginning of the war, the North probably had more of the moral, the high morale of their soldiers. They saw it as something where they were fighting for their home. Even those that weren't slave owners, why are you fighting? I'm fighting because you're down here. I'm fighting to defend my house. Especially at the beginning of the war, the soldiers of the North are trying to fight for some sort of vague idea of constitutional authority. It's maybe a little harder to get fired up and to go fight and die for, a constitutional principle. Does anybody see that as a rallying cry? Let's go die for a constitutional principle. But by the end of the war, that's going to change. Lincoln's going to give this a higher purpose. But especially at the beginning of the war, the Southerners probably have an easier time of explaining, this is why we're doing this. We're fighting to protect our house. That's the way it is from Southern white perspective. Now, the whole war, one slide, how it plays out. In 1861, there's just enough fighting to show that this is going to be a lot more serious than what they thought. Okay. 1862, the South is winning. They actually come in a couple of places where they're actually not just going to not lose, but maybe actually defeat the North, even though the North has clearly superior numbers, everything. It's Robert E. Lee is really good at being a general. And that's the same part in the first half of 1863. Robert E. Lee is running rampant. And then July of 1863 is a turning point. The South loses some pivotal battles at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and then it's all downhill from there. But then the question is, can they string it out and make it bad enough for Lincoln to lose the election in 1864? Because Grant knows what he's doing fighting on the battlefield. Grant, the one that lived just up the road here, has been made commanding general of all the armies of the North, but his tactics were just basically going right at Robert E. Lee, is costing his army thousands of lives. So is that going to cost the war enough popularity that it's going to be over? And then the short answer is no. And then 1865, it's over. All right. So at this point, I need you to pause the tape or actually I'm finished with it. So go ahead and answer those questions right there.